Japan quietly shelved a stealth fighter program that had already made the US nervous. The F-35 is often called the most advanced production fighter on the planet. Japan's canceled fighter program, the FX, was designed to go beyond it. Then, a few years ago, Tokyo walked away from it. Cast your mind back to the early 2000s. Japan's Air Force, the Japan Air Self-Defense Force, or JASDF, is flying aging F-15Js and F-4 Phantoms. The F-4, originally designed in the late 1950s, China is modernizing at a pace that's making every defense planner in Tokyo uncomfortable. And Japan's geography makes the threat worse. It sits at the edge of a vast air defense identification zone, far larger than its land territory, which it has to protect with a relatively small fleet. The obvious solution was to buy the F-22 Raptor, the most capable air superiority fighter ever built. Japan formally asked, and Congress said no. The 1998 Obey Amendment, a single piece of legislation, banned the export of the F-22 entirely to protect its stealth secrets. Japan was turned away flat. So what do when the world's best fighter jet isn't for sale? You build your own. The central question is, did Japan's decision to cancel its domestic stealth fighter program cost the world an aircraft that could have genuinely surpassed the F-35? And is the technology it left behind good enough to matter? On one side, Japan's Ministry of Defense and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, the same company that makes Outlander SUVs and Zero fighters, are now tasked with designing a cutting-edge stealth jet from scratch. On the other side, the F-35, already in production, is already ordered by Japan and backed by the most powerful defense industrial ecosystem on Earth. And, lurking in the background, China, whose J-20 stealth fighter, over 300 now built, is flying patrols over the very waters Japan has to defend. Japan didn't just try to copy what the US had, they tried to leapfrog it. Starting in 2007, Japan's Technical Research and Development Institute, TRDI, formally kicked off what they called the ATDX program, a TDX, Advanced Technology Demonstrator X. The goal wasn't to build a fighter yet, it was to prove Japan could build one. The project was handed to Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. A 40 billion yen construction program, roughly $350 million, began at Mitsubishi's Komaki South plant. That's a lot of money for a demonstrator, but what came out of it was remarkable. The aircraft that emerged was designated the X2, later nicknamed Shinshin, which in Japanese roughly translates to Spirit of the Heart, and it looked the part. Sleek diamond-shaped fuselage, canted twin tails, blended surfaces, very much in the mold of the F-22, but with some features that were genuinely novel. It flew for the first time on April 22, 2016, lifting off from Nagoya Airport and landing at JASDF's Gifu Airfield. The flight lasted 26 minutes, short, but it mattered enormously because that flight made Japan the fourth country in history to fly its own domestically developed stealth jet after the US, Russia, and China. Now here's the part that often gets lost in the headlines. The X2 wasn't just a stealth test. It was flying with a fly-by-optics flight control system and replacing traditional wires with fiber optic cables, which transfer data faster and are immune to electromagnetic interference. It also featured three-dimensional thrust vectoring, 3 paddles on each engine nozzle, giving the pilot near supernatural control over the aircraft's nose at low speeds, useful in a close-in dogfight and almost unheard of outside of American and Russian programs at the time. And then there was the radar. The X2 carried what Japanese engineers called a multifunction RF sensor, an active electronically scanned array, or AESA, designed not just to track targets, but to serve as an electronic warfare suite and communications node simultaneously. one antenna doing 3 jobs. The X2 also flew with skin made from advanced composite ceramic and silicon carbide materials, chosen for stealth and heat management. The radar cross-section reportedly achieved by the demonstrator? The size of a large beetle, according to Japanese defense sources. Compare that to the F-35, which is often cited at roughly the size of a metal golf ball in radar return. By 2016 and 2017, the X2 had completed dozens of test flights. The program was producing real data. Japan had proven its aerospace industry could build stealth aircraft. Before we get into why Japan then stepped back from the program, tell us whether you think Japan should have pushed on with a fully domestic fighter, or was partnering with foreign companies always the smarter play? The X2 was a demonstrator, a subscale proof of concept, roughly a third the size of a full production fighter. Going from that to an actual combat aircraft meant building engines powerful enough to sustain supersonic cruise, integrating weapons systems, developing countermeasures, and producing enough airframes to actually defend the country. The price estimate for that full program came in at around $40 billion. Tokyo blinked. In 2018, Japan's Ministry of Defense stopped seeking funding for the TRDI to continue the X2 program. Officially, the reasons were high R&D costs and the recognition that viable 5th-generation aircraft engine technology, specifically the thrust vectoring engine needed for a full-size fighter, was still beyond Japan's domestic reach at cost-effective scale. So Japan went shopping. They sent requests for information to Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Daewoo and BAE Systems, and Northrop Grumman. The proposals that came back ranged from unimpressive to absurdly expensive. Boeing offered an upgraded F-15. The MOD rejected it outright, not advanced enough. BAE Systems offered the Eurofighter Typhoon. Same problem. Lockheed Martin came in with what looked like the most exciting option on paper, a hybrid of the F-22's airframe with the F-35's avionics. An F-22 body, F-35 brain. Sounds extraordinary, right? The estimated cost was $215 million per aircraft. And there was a catch that made it a non-starter. The same export control laws that prevented Japan from buying the F-22 in the first place would have applied to any derivative. The deal collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. By February 2019, Japan announced it would pursue a Japan-led future fighter program, domestically driven, with foreign collaboration as an option rather than the core of the effort. But here's the thing nobody's talking about. The decade of engineering data, the stealth materials research, the AESA work, the fly-by-optics systems, none of that disappeared when the X2 program ended. Japan has built something you can't buy: institutional knowledge. In early 2019, Japan declared it would develop the FX, later called the Mitsubishi FX, as a Japan-led 6th-generation program. Not the 5th generation, 6th. The concept they were working toward internally had already been named the I-3 fighter, informed, intelligent, instantaneous. What does that mean in practice? The I-3 concept called for a fighter that could receive targeting data from drones, other aircraft, and satellite systems in real time, then process it autonomously and respond faster than any human controller could authorize. Not a pilot making a decision, a system making a recommendation so fast that pilot confirmation becomes nearly instantaneous. Think of it less like a traditional fighter and more like a flying command node with weapons attached. By October 2020, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries was selected as the lead developer. Japan had committed. But then something unexpected happened. In July 2022, a quiet diplomatic shift emerged. Japan and the United Kingdom, who had been talking informally since 2017, announced they were merging their programs. Italy joined. On December 9, 2022, The three governments made it official. The Global Combat Air Program, GCAP, was born. Japan's FX and the UK's Tempest program would become one aircraft, a sixth-generation stealth fighter to be built by three countries, with Japan's Mitsubishi leading the airframe and the UK and Japan co-leading radar development. Now the numbers get genuinely impressive. As of 2025, the GCAP specification calls for a weapons payload roughly double that of the F-35A. The F-35A carries around 18,000 pounds of combined internal and external weapons. Double that is a figure that no current operational Western fighter comes close to. The aircraft is also being designed with a radar system intended to generate 10,000 times more data than current generation systems, enabling it to build its own targeting picture, run electronic warfare operations, and coordinate drone wingmen simultaneously. Range projections suggest the aircraft may be able to cross the Atlantic on internal fuel alone, something the F-35 cannot do without tanker support. And the target service date is fiscal year 2035. Here's the question worth sitting with. If Japan had never been blocked from buying the F-22 in 1998, none of this would exist. Does American export control law accidentally create its own future competition? Leave your take below. China has built over 300 J-20 stealth fighters. That number took 14 years to reach, starting from the J-20's first flight in 2011. By comparison, Russia's Su-57, which flew a year earlier, has only 32 aircraft in service as of recent reporting, including prototypes. In the Pacific, the relevant threat is overwhelmingly Chinese. Japan's Air Defense Identification Zone, the airspace it's responsible for monitoring and defending, is disproportionately large for a country its size. It extends hundreds of miles over the open ocean. Defending that with a small fleet of fighters means each aircraft has to do more, range further, carry more, and survive longer in contested airspace than any Western fighter currently in service can guarantee. The F-35 is genuinely capable. Japan already operates F-35s and will continue to. But the F-35 was designed as a multi-role strike aircraft and stealth platform, not primarily as a long-range air superiority machine. Its combat radius, roughly 700 miles on internal fuel in a standard configuration, starts to look tight when you're defending sea lanes 800 miles from your coast. The GCAP aircraft, by contrast, is being designed explicitly as a long-range deep penetration aircraft capable of operating inside contested airspace without relying on external data links that might be jammed. That matters in a Pacific fight against Chinese anti-access and area denial systems, a layered missile networks designed to push American and allied air power back from Chinese coastlines. Japan's contribution to GCAP isn't just money and factory space. It's the decade of stealth materials research from the X2 program, the fly-by-optics work, the AESA development, the thrust vectoring data, all of it folded into a sixth-generation program that Japan now co-owns, meaning Japan controls its own software, its own modifications, its own export decisions. That last point matters enormously. One of the most consistent frustrations Japan had with the F-35, and one reason defense planners kept pushing for a domestic program, is that mission data files for the F-35, the software that determines how the radar and electronic warfare systems behave, are generated by the U.S. Air Force's 350th Spectrum Warfare Wing in Florida, and Japan cannot modify them unilaterally. With GCAP, Japan gets freedom of action, freedom of modification, and freedom of export. So, did Japan kill its most ambitious fighter program too soon? The honest answer is no and yes. The X2 Shinshin proved that Japan could build a stealth aircraft. The fly-by-optics, the AESA radar, the 3D thrust vectoring, the composite skin, It was real engineering, and it worked. But the gap between a demonstrator and a combat-ready fighter was measured in tens of billions of dollars, and engine technology Japan simply didn't have. Walking away from a domestic-only program wasn't a weakness, it was math. What Japan did brilliantly was refuse every bad deal that came after. Rejected the F-15 upgrade, rejected the Typhoon, called the F-22 hybrid bluff when the price hit $215 million a jet. And instead of settling, Japan waited until it found a partnership with the UK and Italy that gave it genuine co-ownership of the program, not just a manufacturing license. First, the technology from the X2 didn't disappear. It became the foundation of Japan's contribution to GCAP, and it's one reason Japan has real leverage in that program, rather than being a junior partner writing checks. Second, the GCAP aircraft, if it hits its 2035 target, will be the first sixth-generation combat aircraft to enter service anywhere in the world. A weapons bay twice the size of the F-35s, a radar generating 10,000 times more data, transatlantic internal range, and full sovereign software control for 3 nations. That's a genuine generational leap, not just an upgrade. Third, China's J-20 fleet is growing. Japan's F-35s are already flying. Seeing the gap between now and 2035 is the dangerous window. And how Japan manages that gap, whether through additional F-35 orders, F-15J upgrades, or the long-shot possibility of acquiring the American F-47, is the real story still being written. The arms race in Pacific airspace is accelerating. China is not standing still. Reports in 2025 indicate Japan even reached out to India about possible GCAP involvement. The program is gaining altitude, but so is the threat. And there's one more wild card nobody has resolved. In early 2025, it was reported that President Trump offered Japan the American F-47, the U.S. Air Force's own sixth-generation fighter, in a direct call with Prime Minister Ishiba. If Japan took that deal, GCAP might fracture. So Tokyo's answer will shape the future of Pacific air power for the next 30 years. So, did Japan's canceled fighter program set the stage for something better than the F-35? The answer is yes. The X2 Shinshin was never going to fly into combat. But it proved Japan belonged in the conversation, bought the institutional knowledge that now sits inside GCAP, and forced a decade of diplomatic creativity that produced a sixth-generation program Japan actually controls. The question now isn't whether Japan will have a next-generation fighter, it's whether GCAP delivers before the threat outpaces the timeline, and whether an offer from Washington blows the whole thing apart before the first prototype even flies. If you were advising Tokyo right now, what's the move? GCAP, the F-47, or more F-35s? Tell me why in the comments.